From the party of stability to causing earthquakes, from the party of business to...
I think that what you've just outlined demonstrates how the vast majority of people in this country are feeling at the moment. And I've obviously been knocking on countless doors across the country for this local elections today. And what I have encountered is real fear about how people are going to pay their energy bills, how people are going to afford their weekly shop.
Haig's economic revolution, the backbench rebellion that could save Labour. Before we dive into what might be the most significant political earthquake to hit Westminster since Brexit, make absolutely sure you hit that subscribe button. What I'm about to reveal about Louise Haig's decision to reject deputy leadership and wage war on Britain's economic orthodoxy could fundamentally reshape not just Labour's future, but the entire direction of British politics. Louise Haig has just done something extraordinary in modern British politics. She's chosen principle over position, influence over office, and long-term transformation over short-term advancement. The Sheffield Heeley MP's decision to decline running for Labour deputy leadership isn't just a personal career choice. It's a declaration of war against the economic establishment that has constrained British ambition for more than a decade. And here's the truly remarkable part. She might be the only politician in Westminster with the courage to say what everyone else is thinking but won't admit. I'm not seeking to become the deputy leader of the Labour Party. I want the liberty to campaign for an economic reset. Haig declared with a kind of political clarity that's been absent from British discourse for years. This isn't the language of compromise or careful positioning. This is a voice of someone who understands that Britain's problems require fundamental solutions, not cosmetic adjustments to a failing system. But let's examine what Haig means by economic reset, because her critique of Britain's current economic framework is nothing short of revolutionary. And if you're not already subscribed to UK Connors, you absolutely should be, because this analysis is about to expose the hidden constraints that have been strangling British economic growth for over a decade. Haig has identified something that mainstream politicians have been afraid to acknowledge. The Office of Budget Responsibility, created by David Cameron in 2010, has become a straitjacket that prevents governments from making the kind of long-term investments that actually transform economies. The OBR's mandate is to assess public finances and determine whether governments are meeting their self-imposed debt and deficit targets. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Except here's a problem that Haig has spotted. The OBR's short-term analysis framework cannot account for the long-term benefits of transformative policy investments. When you're forced to judge every government expenditure by its immediate impact on debt ratios rather than its long-term economic returns, you systematically bias policymaking toward inaction and incremental change. This is genuinely radical thinking, and make sure you're subscribed, because what Haig is proposing represents a fundamental challenge to the entire post-2010 consensus on economic policy. She's arguing that Labour was elected to transform Britain, not to manage decline within constraints imposed by unelected technocrats who prioritize accounting spreadsheets over economic dynamism. It's the kind of argument that could either destroy her political career or establish her as the intellectual leader of a new economic paradigm. Consider the specific examples Haig provides of how current economic orthodoxy constrains transformative policy. Sure Start, Labour's early childhood intervention program, was abandoned not because it didn't work. The evidence shows it was extraordinarily successful, but because its long-term economic benefits couldn't be captured in the OBR's short-term modeling framework. This is economic insanity disguised as fiscal responsibility, and Haig is the first senior politician brave enough to call it out directly. The technical details of Haig's critique reveal someone who genuinely understands how modern monetary policy works, rather than relying on the simplified narratives that dominate political discourse. Her analysis of quantitative easing and its reversal, the cost of inflation-linked bonds, and the £40 billion annual subsidy to commercial banks through interest on reserves demonstrates policy expertise that puts most Treasury ministers to shame. This isn't populist economics. This is sophisticated analysis of how financial engineering has systematically drained public resources while constraining public investment. Here's where Haig's argument becomes particularly compelling, and if you're finding this as intellectually stimulating as I am, hit that subscribe button and share this with anyone who thinks they understand British economic policy. She's identified that other major economies, Switzerland, the European Union, don't operate the same policy constraints that Britain has imposed on itself. We've created artificial limitations that have no basis in economic necessity or international best practice, and then convinced ourselves that these limitations represent responsible governance. The £40 billion annual transfer to commercial banks that Hague highlights is particularly scandalous when you consider it in the context of underfunded public services and constrained public investment. This represents a direct transfer from taxpayers to financial institutions that serves no obvious public purpose and operates through mechanisms that most MPs don't understand, let alone question. Hague's willingness to challenge these arrangements suggests someone who understands that technical complexity is often used to disguise political choices that wouldn't survive democratic scrutiny. But the most significant aspect of Hague's position isn't the technical critique of economic policy. It's a fundamental argument about democracy and accountability. It's not democratic when unelected organizations like the OBR set the boundaries of government ambition, she argues, and this strikes at the heart of Britain's post-crisis governance arrangements. If elected governments cannot pursue policies that voters support because technocratic institutions deem them inconsistent with arbitrary fiscal rules, then democracy becomes a theatre performance rather than a mechanism for popular sovereignty. This connects to broader questions about the relationship between finance and democracy that have been bubbling under the surface of British politics since the 2008 financial crisis. And make sure you're subscribed because this analysis is going to become increasingly relevant as these tensions come to a head. Hague is articulating something that many people sense but few politicians will acknowledge. The current system prioritizes financial stability over democratic accountability, and that this arrangement is both economically counterproductive and politically unsustainable. The timing of Hague's intervention is strategically brilliant. Rather than accepting a deputy leadership role that would require her to defend policies she clearly believes are inadequate, she's positioning herself as the intellectual leader of Labour's economic renewal. This isn't political suicide. It's political entrepreneurship of the highest order. She's betting that Labour's current economic approach will fail, and that when it does, the party will need leaders who are arguing for fundamental change rather than defending incremental adjustments. Her warning about another 10 years of inactivity and managed decline disguised as moderation reveals someone who understands the scale of Britain's economic challenges and the inadequacy of conventional political responses. This isn't rhetoric. It's a genuine assessment that current policy trajectories will produce continued stagnation while other countries pull ahead through more dynamic economic strategies. The deputy leadership contest that Hague has declined to enter provides fascinating insight into Labour's internal dynamics and future direction. The potential candidates, Emily Thornberry, Ed Miliband, David Lammy, Lisa Nandy, Wes Streeting, Stella Creasy, represent different facets of Labour's political spectrum, but none of them are articulating the kind of fundamental economic critique that Hague is advancing. This suggests that her backbench position might actually provide more influence over long-term policy direction than any frontbench role. Emily Thornberry's warning about handing our country to Nigel Farage if Labour makes further mistakes highlights exactly the political dynamic that Hague is trying to address. And if you're not already part of our community, subscribe now because this connection is crucial for understanding British politics over the next few years. Farage's appeal is based partly on the perception that mainstream politicians cannot deliver the kind of economic transformation that would improve ordinary people's lives. If Labour continues operating within constraints that make transformative change impossible, they are essentially validating Farage's critique of the political establishment. Ed Miliband's popularity among party members, with his plus 74 net approval rating, demonstrates that there's appetite within Labour for more radical approaches to economic policy. Miliband's own experience as party leader, where he was criticized for being too left-wing and then vindicated when many of his policies were adopted by subsequent governments, provides a template for how politicians can be ahead of the political curve while eventually being proven correct. The broader context of this deputy leadership contest reveals a party struggling to define its identity after a difficult first year in government. Angela Rayner's resignation and the speculation about various potential successors suggest internal tensions about both policy direction and political strategy. Hague's decision to stay outside this contest while advocating for fundamental economic change positions her as potentially the most influential figure in shaping Labour's future direction. But here's what makes Hague's position particularly interesting from a strategic perspective, and make sure you're subscribed because this kind of political analysis is exactly what mainstream coverage misses. By choosing backbench independence over frontbench responsibility, she's free to advocate for policies that might be politically difficult in the short term but economically necessary in the long term. She can build intellectual and political support for economic transformation without being constrained by the day-to-day compromises that frontbench politics requires. The international dimension of Haig's critique deserves particular attention because it reveals how Britain has imposed constraints on itself that other successful economies avoid. Her comparison with Swiss and European approaches to monetary policy suggests that Britain's economic problems aren't inevitable consequences of global conditions, but specific results of policy choices that can be changed if there's sufficient political will. This connects to broader questions about Britain's economic model and international competitiveness that have been largely absent from mainstream political debate. If other countries can maintain economic dynamism while avoiding the kind of fiscal constraints that Britain has imposed on itself, then those constraints represent political choices rather than economic necessities. Haig is arguing that Britain can choose a different path if it's willing to challenge the orthodoxies that have dominated policymaking since 2010. The technical complexity of modern economic policy often allows politicians to avoid discussing fundamental questions about priorities and trade-offs. Haig's willingness to engage with these technical details while maintaining focus on their democratic and economic implications suggests someone who understands that effective political leadership requires both policy expertise and clear communication about what's at stake. Her emphasis on workers' rights and the climate crisis alongside economic transformation reveals someone who understands that these challenges are interconnected rather than competing priorities. Traditional approaches that treat environmental protection as a constraint on economic growth or worker protections as obstacles to competitiveness miss a potential for integrated strategies that advance multiple objectives simultaneously. The infrastructure investments that Haig advocates represent exactly the kind of long-term thinking that current fiscal frameworks discourage. Building world-class infrastructure requires upfront public investment that may increase debt ratios in the short term while generating economic returns over decades. If your policy framework can only evaluate short-term fiscal impacts, you systematically bias decision-making against exactly the kind of investments that drive long-term prosperity. Haig's critique of quantitative easing and its reversal highlights how monetary policy has become a mechanism for transferring resources from taxpayers to financial institutions while constraining fiscal policy options for elected governments. This isn't a technical detail. It's a fundamental question about whether economic policy serves public purposes or private interests, and whether democratic governments retain meaningful control over economic outcomes. The £40 billion annual cost of supporting commercial banks through interest on reserves that Haig identifies represents a massive opportunity cost when public services remain underfunded and infrastructure investment is constrained by arbitrary fiscal rules. This transfer operates through mechanisms that are deliberately obscure and technically complex, making democratic oversight almost impossible while imposing real costs on taxpayers. As the deputy leadership contest unfolds and potential candidates position themselves for Labour's future, Haig's decision to remain on the backbenches while advocating for economic transformation could prove to be the most strategically significant move. She's betting that current economic policies will fail, that voters will demand fundamental change rather than continued managed decline, and that Labour will eventually need leaders who are advocating for transformation rather than defending incrementalism. The stakes couldn't be higher for both Labour and Britain. If Haig is correct that current economic constraints make transformative change impossible, then Labour faces a prospect of disappointing voters who elected them to deliver renewal while operating within a framework designed to prevent exactly that kind of change. The alternative that Haig is proposing, challenging the economic orthodoxy that has constrained British ambition since 2010, represents either political suicide or the foundation for genuine economic transformation. Subscribe to UK Connors to follow every development in this crucial debate about Britain's economic future, because Haig's backbench rebellion could be the beginning of the most significant challenge to economic orthodoxy since Margaret Thatcher. Whether she succeeds or fails, her willingness to articulate what others won't say makes her essential viewing for anyone serious about understanding where British politics is heading.